Late afternoon sun streamed through the Harpers' wide bay windows, casting golden streaks across the polished wood floors of their Connecticut country home. The house, a two-story colonial with crisp white siding and black shutters, was carved from a dream of American affluence. Inside, the air was lightly scented with lavender from a diffuser on the mantel, mingling with the rich smell of fried chicken wafting from the kitchen. To anyone passing by, the scene was picture perfect. A family of four, wallowing in affluence, the embodiment of the American dream. Daniel Harper, 42, leaned back in his leather chair, the slight creak of which mingled with the soft jazz strains pouring from his vintage record player. His home office, tucked away at the end of a hallway, was a sanctuary of dark wood and legal Times, each neatly lined up on shelves behind him. As a partner at Sterling and Walsh, one of Hartford's most prestigious law firms, Daniel spent his days in a whirlwind of court dates, client meetings, and late-night case reviews. His navy blue tailored suit jacket hung on a coat rack, his tie slightly loosened, signaling the end of the workday. He rubbed his temples, feeling the slight throb of a headache left over from arguing over a major corporate merger that morning. Across the house, in the kitchen, Emily Harper moved with the polished grace of someone who had perfected the art of housekeeping. At 39, she was still strikingly attractive, her auburn hair pulled back into a loose bun, her green eyes sharp but softened by years of motherhood. She wore a cream blouse and skinny jeans with an apron tied loosely over them. She was chopping vegetables for dinner, the rhythmic tap of her knife on the cutting board almost meditative. But her mind was elsewhere. She glanced at the clock on the wall, 5:47, and her lips pressed into a thin line. Another night where routine would reign supreme. Their children, Sophie and Ethan, were upstairs. Sophie, 16, was sprawled on her bed, headphones in, engrossed in her phone as if she were hunting for clues in a detective story. Her room was a kaleidoscope of teenage chaos, strings of lights hanging over her headboard, an unfinished watercolor on her easel, and a pile of laundry she'd vowed to fold tomorrow. Ethan, 12, was in his room, engrossed in a video game, the sound of virtual explosions drowned out by noise-canceling headphones. To an outsider, they were just kids bright, slightly rebellious, but loved. On the outside, the Harpers seemed the epitome of success. Daniel's career was flourishing. Emily's volunteer work at the local library and Ta earned quiet admiration. Sophie was an excellent student with dreams of going to Yale. Ethan, though quieter, was a math whiz and a chess master. They attended church almost every Sunday, hosted barbecues in their manicured garden, and sent out elegant Christmas cards every December. But beneath the surface, a crack was slowly spreading, invisible to their neighbors, but palpable to those who lived within those walls. Daniel pushed himself away from the table, his chair rolling back with a soft thud. He stood, stretching, and glanced at the framed family photo on the table, a spontaneous snapshot from their trip to Cape Cod 2 summers ago. Emily's smile was wide, her arm around Sophie, who was laughing at something Ethan had said. Daniel's own smile was casual, genuine. He could still feel the salty sea air on his skin and hear the crash of the waves. But the memory felt foreign. When has it all changed? He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the warmth of the photo stood in stark contrast to the chill that had settled into their home. He walked into the kitchen, where Emily was putting a chicken in the oven. "It smells good," he said, his voice warm but careful, like he was treading on thin ice. She glanced over her shoulder, giving him a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you," she replied, drying her hands on a towel. "Dinner will be ready in about an hour." He nodded, leaning against the counter, trying to find something to say. The silence hung heavy with unspoken words. He noticed a small notebook on the table, its cover a soft blue with a subtle floral pattern. Emily's handwriting swirls across the pages, but he can't make out the words from where he stands. She'd always loved to write short poems, shopping lists, notes to herself, but lately the notebooks seemed to multiply, appearing in unexpected places around the house. He'd found one in the glove compartment of her car, another under a pillow in the living room. He hadn't looked at them, but their presence bothered him, like a quiet signal from something he couldn't name. "Is everything okay?" he asked, trying to keep his voice light but with a hint of curiosity. Emily froze, her hand hovering over the cutting board. "Sure," she said, her tone even but slightly sharp. "Just planning my week. Sophie has debate practice, and Ethan has a chess tournament this weekend." Daniel nodded, though he sensed she was evading the question. He wanted to press her, to ask why she seemed so distant, why her smiles were so dramatic. But he remained silent. Instead, he grabbed a bottle of sparkling water from the refrigerator and went into the living room, where the television was blaring the evening news. He sank down onto the couch, the leather cool against his back, and stared at the screen, not paying attention. Upstairs, Sophie pulled out her headphones, the sudden silence adding to the hum of the house. She sat up, her gaze drifting to the notebook on her nightstand. It was one of her mother's, left over from a rare moment when Emily had sat on her bed, listening to Sophie complain about a fight she'd had with her best friend Mia. Sophie hadn't meant to peek, but the notebook was open, and one line caught her eye. "I don't know how much longer I can pretend." The words cut into her chest, sharp and disturbing. She hadn't told anyone, not even Mia, but they haunted her. What was her mother pretending to be? The question gnawed at her, but she didn't dare ask. Ethan, meanwhile, was unaware of these undercurrents. His world was simpler pixels and pawns, equations and strategies. But even he noticed the changes. His parents didn't laugh as much anymore. His mom's hugs were tighter, almost desperate, and his dad spent more time in his office than at the dinner table. Ethan couldn't put it into words, but he felt it a quiet unraveling, like a sweater caught on a nail. Dinner that night was a study in normality. The table was set with fine china, reflecting Emily's desire to keep it civil. Roast chicken, garlic mashed potatoes, and kale salad sat in the center, steam rising in lazy tendrils. Daniel poured wine for himself and Emily, while Sophie and Ethan sipped sparkling cider. Conversation was light news from school, a funny story about Ethan's math teacher, plans for the upcoming fall festival. But there were pauses, moments when the clink of cutlery on plates was the only sound. Emily's eyes wandered to her plate, her fingers fiddling nervously with the napkin in her lap. Daniel cleared his throat, interjecting a comment about the weather or something he was doing at work, but his words filled in the void rather than bridged it. After dinner, while Emily loaded the dishwasher and Daniel retreated to his office, Sophie lingered in the kitchen. She watched her mother, noticing the way her shoulders slumped when she thought no one was looking. "Mom," Sophie said, her voice hesitant, "are you okay?" Emily sat up straight, her face instantly returning to its usual warmth. "Sure, honey. Just tired. You know how it is, there's always something to do." Sophie nodded, unconvinced. She wanted to ask about the notebook, about that disturbing phrase, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she hugged her mother, and the hug lasted a little longer than usual. Emily squeezed her tighter, and for a moment Sophie felt a current of unspoken things pass between them. As night fell, the Harper household fell silent. Ethan slept, still clutching his controller. Sophie lay under the covers, scrolling through her phone, the blue light casting shadows on her face. Daniel sat in his study, staring at a case file he hadn't touched in 20 minutes, and Emily, in the bedroom, sat at her vanity, a notebook open in front of her. Her pen hovered over the page, then lowered, the ink flowing in neat, deliberate strokes. "I thought love was enough. Now I'm not so sure." The house, with its shiny surfaces and carefully chosen decor, held its breath. The Harpers were a family on the brink of something they couldn't yet name, a crack that would soon demand recognition, dragging them into a storm none of them were prepared for. Tuesday morning at the Harper house began with a deceptively ordinary air. The morning light filtered through the blinds, painting streaks across the kitchen counter where Emily was already preparing breakfast. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the smell of toasted bread, and the radio hummed a classic rock tune in the background. Sophie, sleepy and slightly disheveled, came downstairs, fiddling with the strap of her backpack, and Ethan, as usual, was glued to his phone, absorbed in yet another puzzle. Daniel, now in his impeccable suit, was leafing through the morning paper, but his gaze was unfocused, as if he were searching for answers not in the headlines, but somewhere beyond the pages. No one could have predicted that this day would be the point of no return. After 17 years of marriage woven from compromises, habits, and unspoken grievances, Emily was preparing to strike a blow that would upend their world. She stood at the stove, flipping pancakes, but her movements were mechanical, her mind far away. In her bag, carelessly thrown over a chair, was an envelope containing the documents she had picked up the day before from her lawyer, Catherine Wells, a woman with a reputation for steely professionalism and the ability to win even the most difficult divorce cases. Daniel folded the paper, finished his coffee, and glanced at Emily. "Do you have anything planned today?" he asked, trying to sound casual. His voice was warm, but there was a familiar caution to it, as if he had long ago learned to avoid sharp edges in their conversations. Emily turned, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes met his, and for a moment Daniel saw something unfamiliar in them, not just weariness, but a determination that bordered on cold steel. "Yes, there is," she said, her voice flat, almost emotionless. She did not elaborate, and Daniel, accustomed to her evasive answers, did not press her. He kissed Sophie's forehead, ruffled Ethan's hair, and left, grabbing his briefcase. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and the house was silent except for the clink of dishes as Emily put them away in the sink. When the kids left for school, Emily was alone. She sat at the kitchen table, pulled an envelope from her bag, and ran her fingers over its smooth surface. Inside were the papers she had been quietly preparing for the past 3 months. A divorce petition asking for full custody of Sophie and Ethan, the house, and 70% of their property. Every word in the papers had been carefully considered, every line the result of sleepless nights spent lying next to Daniel, feeling the distance between them grow like a chasm. She accused him of being cold, controlling, and abusive terms that Catherine had helped her formulate, translating her vague feelings into legalese. Emily wasn't sure when exactly her love for Daniel began to fade. Maybe it was the years when he'd come home late, consumed by work, leaving her alone with the kids and empty evenings. Maybe it was his habit of making decisions for both of them, from choosing their kids' schools to how they spent their holidays, that slowly eroded her independence. Or maybe it was his words, casually thrown out but cutting like splinters. "Emily, you're overreacting. You just don't understand how this works. Why can't you just relax?" Over time, these phrases became more than just an annoyance. They were proof that her voice in their marriage was irrelevant. She stood up, went to the window, and looked out. Her neighbor, Mrs. Clark, was watering her roses, and the postman was pushing his bicycle leisurely along the sidewalk. The world outside seemed as orderly as ever, but inside Emily, chaos was raging. She knew Daniel would be stunned, that he would not see this blow. He had considered their marriage stable, if not perfect. He had not noticed how she was withdrawing into herself, how her journals, the ones he had seen, but never opened, had become her only refuge, the place where she could be honest with herself. Meanwhile, Daniel was driving to the office, his Mercedes gliding through the streets of Hartford. The radio was off, and in the silence he tried to make sense of the vague unease that had been plaguing him for the past few weeks. Emily had changed. She was quieter, more distant. Her smiles were few and far between. He chalked it up to stress, to her children's ages, to her volunteer work. But deep down he knew the problem was deeper. He remembered finding another notebook of hers last week, this one in a dresser drawer, and how his fingers had hovered over the cover, but he hadn't dared to look inside. It would have been an intrusion, a violation of her privacy, but now he wished he had. Maybe there was a clue to what was going on there. At the office, Daniel buried himself in his work, but his thoughts kept drifting back to home. He sent Emily a text. "How are you? Maybe we can go out to dinner tonight." An hour later, she responded, short and dry. "Not tonight. Busy." He frowned, but brushed off the worry. She was just in a mood, he thought. It would pass. But later that day, late in the afternoon, his world came crashing down. When he got home, Emily was waiting for him in the living room. She was sitting on the couch, her posture tense, her hands folded in her lap. On the coffee table in front of her was the envelope. Sophie and Ethan were visiting friends. She'd made sure they weren't home. Daniel paused in the doorway, his briefcase still in his hand, and looked at her. "Emily, is something wrong?" he asked, his voice shaking with sudden apprehension. She looked up, and there was no warmth or doubt in her eyes. "Sit down, Daniel," she said quietly but firmly. He obeyed, sinking into the chair opposite her. She slid the envelope toward him. "These are divorce papers," she continued, her voice calm but steely. "I'm filing for divorce. I want full custody of the kids, the house, and 70% of our assets." Daniel froze, his mind refusing to process her words. He stared at the envelope as if it were a bomb ready to explode. What are you saying?" he finally managed, his voice hoarse. "Emily, is this some kind of joke?" She shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. "This is not a joke. I can't live like this anymore. You've been suffocating me all these years. Your coldness, your control, your constant pressure. It's mental abuse, Danielle. I'm tired of pretending everything is okay." His eyes widened and he leaned forward, gripping the arms of his chair. "Emotional abuse, Emily, what are you even talking about? I worked to provide for all of us. I tried to make sure you had everything you needed. How can you accuse me of that?" Her gaze hardened. "You never asked me what I wanted. You decided for me, for all of us. You made me feel like my desires, my thoughts, meant nothing. I was a decoration for you, Daniel, not a partner." He shook his head, his face pale. "That's not true. I loved you. I love you. We were happy, weren't we? 17 years, Emily. How can you just ruin everything?" She looked away, her fingers tightening on the edge of the couch. "We weren't happy? Maybe you didn't notice, but I was suffocating. I can't take it anymore. And the kids, they'll be better off with me." The word kids hit him like a hammer. "You want to take Sophie and Ethan? You think I'm just going to give them to you? Emily, this is crazy." His voice broke, and he stood up, running a hand through his hair. "I don't understand where this all came from. We were living a normal life. Yeah, we had our problems, but who doesn't? We could talk, go to marriage counseling." "I've tried to talk," she interrupted, her voice growing louder. "Years, Daniel. I tried, but you wouldn't listen. You were always too busy, too sure you knew what was best. I don't want to try anymore." He sank back into his chair, his hands shaking. He looked at her, searching her face for some hint of the Emily he knew, the woman who had laughed at his jokes, who had danced with him at their wedding, who had held his hand when Sophie was born. But this was a different woman, resolute, unyielding, alien. "You've already decided, haven't you?" he asked quietly, his voice full of pain. "You planned it all without telling me a word." Emily nodded, her eyes shining but no tears. "Yes, I had to. For me, for the kids." He took the envelope, his fingers shaking as he opened it. The papers inside were cold, official, their language merciless. He ran his eyes over the text, and each word, divorce, custody, property, cut into him like a knife. 70%. The house, the children. She wanted to leave him with nothing. "I'm not signing this," he said finally, his voice low but steely. "You can't just cut me out of our lives. I'm going to fight, Emily. I'm a lawyer, damn it. You think I'm just going to give in?" Her lips twitched, but she didn't back down. "Do what you want, Daniel, but I won't change my mind." The silence that followed her words was deafening. Daniel stood up, threw the envelope on the table, and walked out of the room. He went upstairs to his office and closed the door, as if that would shut him out from reality. He sat at his desk, staring at the family photo that had been there for years. His fingers curled into fists, and he felt something inside him crumble, not just his marriage, but his entire life, everything he had ever thought was secure. Meanwhile, Emily stood in the living room, her heart pounding. She had done it. After months of doubt, fear, and secret meetings with her lawyer, she had finally told the truth. But there was no relief. Instead, she felt an emptiness mixed with anxiety. She knew Daniel would not go down without a fight. He was a lawyer, one of the best, and his pride, His stubbornness would not let him just walk away. But she was ready. Catherine had warned her that this would be a dirty business, that Daniel would use all his connections, all his knowledge, to maintain control. But Emily was no longer afraid. She was tired of being afraid. Upstairs, Sophie and Ethan returned home and sensed that something was wrong. The house was too quiet, the air too heavy. Sophie knocked on her father's study door, but he didn't answer. She went downstairs and found her mother in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a blank look in her eyes. "Mom, what's going on?" she asked, her voice shaking. Emily looked at her daughter, and for a moment her resolve wavered, but she forced a smile. "It's okay, honey. Just adult stuff. Go to your homework." Sophie didn't believe it, but she didn't argue. She went to her room, her heart clenched with worry. Ethan, as always, was in his own world, but even he noticed that Mom was strange and Dad was absent. Night had fallen on the Harper household, but no one was sleeping. Daniel sat in his study, going over documents, his mind searching for loopholes, strategies, ways to regain control. Emily lay in her bedroom, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts a mixture of determination and fear. Sophie wrote in her journal, trying to sort out her feelings. Ethan, curled under the covers, wondered why adults always made things so complicated. The house that had once been their refuge was now the arena for the coming war. The blow had been dealt, and no one knew what would be left when the dust settled. Fog hung over Hartford, casting a gray shroud over the streets, as if the city were trying to shelter from an approaching storm. The Harper household was eerily quiet, but it was deceptive, like the calm before a hurricane. It had been a week since Emily had handed Daniel the divorce papers, and since then their lives had become a fragile mosaic, ready to crumble at the slightest push. Every step, every word was now booby-trapped, and no one knew where the next trap would lie. Daniel had moved into the guest bedroom on the ground floor, his suits and books neatly stacked in the closet, as if he were a temporary tenant in his own home. He tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy for the sake of the children, but his eyes betrayed him a mixture of hurt, anger, and confusion. He couldn't understand how Emily, the woman he'd shared nearly 2 decades with, could turn on him so suddenly. Her accusations, coldness, control, emotional abuse sounded like accusations from someone else's life. He sifted through their years together, trying to find the moment when it all went wrong, but the memories slipped through his fingers like sand. Emily, on the other hand, seemed composed, almost frighteningly calm. She continued to run the household, take Ethan to chess, and help Sophie with her essay for a school competition. But her movements were precise, like a surgeon's, her smiles practiced, as if she had rehearsed them in front of a mirror. Inside, she was teetering on the edge. She knew Daniel would not sign the papers without a fight, and she was preparing for it. Her lawyer, Catherine Wells, had already begun collecting evidence. Entries from Emily's diaries, testimonies from friends who had noticed her distress, even old letters in which Daniel had sounded bossy or dismissive without realizing it. Emily didn't want war, but she was prepared for it if it meant freedom. Caught between their parents, Sophie and Ethan felt their world crumbling. Sophie, with her keen mind and sensitivity, was the first to notice what was happening. She overheard snatches of her parents' conversation one night when they thought the kids were asleep. The words divorce and custody pierced her like shards of glass. She didn't mention it to Ethan, he was too wrapped up in his games to notice the details, but she began to pay attention. She saw her mother hiding her notebooks, her father staying at the office longer than usual. Questions swirled in her head, but she was afraid to ask them, afraid that the answers would destroy the last illusion of stability. Ethan, though less observant, felt the changes too. His mother hugged him more often, but the hugs were desperate, as if she were afraid he would disappear. His father, on the other hand, became quieter, the jokes he used to make to lighten the mood at dinner no longer there. Ethan didn't know what to call it, but he felt like home no longer felt safe. He retreated into his games, where the rules were clear and the enemies predictable, unlike the real world. That Friday night, Daniel came home earlier than usual, his jacket slightly rumpled and a bottle of red wine in his hands, as if he were hoping for a truce. Emily was in the kitchen, making lasagna, her hair pulled back into a loose ponytail, her face tense. The kids were upstairs, and the house seemed too big for their silent confrontation. Maybe we should have dinner together, like before, Daniel suggested, putting the bottle on the table. His voice was soft, but there was a hint of hope mixed with caution. Emily looked at him, her hands hovering over the pan. Daniel, this won't change anything, she said quietly but firmly. We can't pretend everything is okay. His jaw clenched, his fingers tightening on the edge of the tabletop. I'm not pretending, Emily. I'm trying to understand what's going on. You're throwing these accusations at me, but you're not giving me a chance to explain. You want to destroy our family, and I'm supposed to just go along with it. Her eyes flashed, but she held back. I'm not breaking up a family. I'm trying to save myself. And the kids. You don't see how your behavior affects us. You never have. He shook his head, his voice growing louder. My behavior, I worked so you could have everything. This house, Sophie's school, Ethan's tournaments, all of that is me. And you accuse me of being some kind of tyrant. Emily stepped toward him, her voice shaking with suppressed anger. It's not about the money, Daniel. It's about the way you made me feel invisible. You decided what we needed without asking. You criticize my ideas, my dreams, until I forget who I was. That's control. That's abuse. The word violence hung in the air like a blow. Daniel stepped back, his face pale. Are you serious? Are you comparing me to some kind of monster? Emily, I have never raised a hand against you, never humiliated you in front of others. How can you say that? She looked away, her hands shaking. There are things worse than physical abuse. You just don't understand. The conversation was interrupted when Sophie came downstairs, her footsteps almost silent. She stopped in the kitchen doorway, her eyes darting between her parents. What's going on? She asked, her voice thin but filled with concern. Emily forced a smile. It's okay, honey. Go upstairs. Dinner will be ready soon. But Sophie didn't budge. Are you arguing again? I heard you. Why can't you just talk normally? Daniel looked at his daughter, his heart sinking. Sophie, this is adult stuff. We'll figure it out. She snorted, her eyes shining with tears. You always say that, but you don't understand anything. I'm not blind, Dad, and I'm not stupid. She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing on the stairs. Emily and Daniel were left standing, separated not only by the kitchen island, but also by the chasm they had dug themselves. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but thought better of it. He grabbed a bottle of wine and went into the living room, where he turned on the television, but the sound was just background noise to his thoughts. The next day, Daniel met with his lawyer, Martin Craig, an old friend and colleague whose reputation in family matters was almost legendary. They sat in Martin's cozy office, the walls of which were covered with diplomas and golf tournament photos. Daniel handed him the copies of the documents, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. Martin scanned the papers, his brow furrowed. She's going all in, he said, putting the papers down. Full custody, the house, 70%. That's aggressive, Dan. She's obviously serious. Who's her lawyer? Catherine Wells, Daniel replied, his voice grim. I made inquiries. She's good. Very good. Martin nodded, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Wells likes to play on emotions. She'll probably build a case around your alleged mental abuse. We need to disprove that. Gather evidence on your side correspondence, testimony from colleagues, friends, even school teachers. We need to show that you were an active father, a caring husband. And also, you need to be prepared for this to get dirty. She could pull out anything. Daniel clenched his fists. I don't want the children to suffer, Martin, but I won't give them up. And I won't let Emily take away everything we've built. Martin looked at him sympathetically. I understand, but you need to control yourself. The judges don't like it when emotions get the better of you. We'll play by the rules, but tough. Meanwhile, Emily met with Catherine in her office. which was the polar opposite of Martin's minimalist, with white walls and a glass desk. Catherine, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and immaculate hair, leafed through Emily's notes. "This is strong stuff," she said, tapping her pen on the page. "Your diaries show a consistent pattern of emotional abuse. We can use that to make a case for mental abuse. Plus, we have evidence from your friends that you were feeling overwhelmed." Emily nodded, but her face was tense. "I don't want the kids to know all this. They're scared enough." Catherine leaned toward her, her voice soft but firm. "I understand, Emily, but Daniel won't go down without a fight. He's a lawyer. He knows how to play this game. If we're going to win custody, we need to be prepared for anything, including him trying to make you look bad." Emily swallowed. "He can do that." Catherine smiled, but it was cold. "He will try, but we will be ready." That evening, Sophie sat in her room, her laptop open to a search engine. She typed in, "What is emotional abuse?" The results were terrifying articles about manipulation, gaslighting, control. She tried to relate it to her father, but the images of cruel tyrants on the internet didn't fit with the man who taught her to ride a bike and applauded her at debates. But she could see the pain in her mother's eyes, and that made her doubt. Ethan, meanwhile, found one of Emily's notebooks in the living room. He hadn't intended to read it, but the page was open and his gaze caught on a phrase, "I'm tired of being a shadow." He didn't understand what it meant, but the words made him uneasy. He put the notebook back and went to his room, but his sleep that night was restless. The Harper household became a battlefield, with everyone preparing for their next move. Daniel was gathering strength to defend his version of the truth. Emily was fortifying her position to break free. Sophie and Ethan were unknowingly becoming pawns in a game they didn't understand. The battle lines had been drawn, and no one knew who would emerge victorious or what would be left when the war was over. The autumn wind blew fallen leaves through the streets of Hartford, dancing beneath the streetlights that were just beginning to glow in the twilight. The city was preparing for the evening, but Daniel Harper's life was in chaos, defying all the laws of nature. It had been 2 weeks since Emily had handed him the divorce papers, and every day since then had been like walking through a minefield. He tried to hold on, for the children, for himself, but he felt the ground slipping from under his feet. His home, once full of warmth, now resembled the set of a play where all the actors had forgotten their lines. Daniel sat in his office at Sterling and Walsh, but his mind was far from the contracts and court records scattered across his desk. He stared at his laptop, where Martin Craig's draft of his counterclaim was open. The words joint custody, division of property, and denial of allegations seemed foreign to him, as if they described someone else's life. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and tried to remember the last time he'd felt truly alive. Maybe it was that walk on the beach on Cape Cod, with Sophie building sandcastles and Emily throwing her head back laughing. Or at Ethan's high school recital, when he and Emily had secretly held hands. Those memories were like old photographs, faded but still precious. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Linda, his assistant, a woman with kind eyes and a habit of bringing him coffee without sugar, even when he didn't ask for it. "Daniel, you have a client meeting in half an hour, but I can reschedule if necessary," she said, poking her head into the office. He shook his head, forcing a smile. "No, it's okay. I can handle it. Thanks, Linda." She nodded, but paused at the door. Are you okay? You look like you haven't slept in a week." Daniel ran a hand over his face, feeling the stubble he'd forgotten to shave. "Just family stuff. Nothing I can't handle." Linda looked at him sympathetically, but did not press the issue. When the door closed behind her, Daniel stood up, went to the window, and looked out at the street. People were going about their business below, unaware that his world was crumbling. He knew he should be focusing on his work, but thoughts of Emily and her accusations were troubling him. How could she call him controlling, cold? He always tried to be the best husband, father, provider. Yes, he was busy, but wasn't he sacrificing for his family? His phone vibrated, and he glanced at the screen. A message from Martin. We need to meet today. There is information about witnesses on her side. This is important. Daniel frowned, feeling anxiety building in his chest. He answered briefly, "Okay. Will 6 be okay?" and returned to the table, but could no longer concentrate. Meanwhile, Emily was in the library, hosting a book club. She sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by women discussing the latest book, a novel about a woman who escapes a toxic marriage. Emily had chosen the book for a reason, but none of the women knew how close it was to her. She smiled, nodding at the comments, but her mind was on the upcoming trial. Catherine Wells had assured her that the case was going their way, but Emily felt fear creeping up on her like a shadow. She knew Daniel would fight, and she wasn't sure at what cost. After the hearing, she lingered in the library, sorting through returned books. It was a routine task that calmed her, allowing her to forget about paperwork and lawyers for a while. She didn't notice Sarah Miller, an old acquaintance with whom she had once been close, but with whom she had grown distant after Emily had become immersed in family life, approaching her. "Emily, it's been a while," Sarah said, her voice warm but slightly wary. She was tall, with short hair and bright earrings that jingled with every movement. "How are you? You seem thoughtful." Emily smiled, but it was a tight smile. "Just a lot to do. Kids' house, you know how it is." Sarah narrowed her eyes, as if trying to see past her facade. "Yeah, I know, but you've always been a master at being in control. I remember you planning every move back in college, always knowing what you want." Emily tensed, but tried not to show it. "Well, life changes plans," she replied, trying to sound light. Sarah nodded, but her gaze was sharp. "That's true, but you always found a way to turn things around. Good luck with whatever you're doing now." She winked and walked away, leaving Emily feeling like she'd just been found out. When Emily got home, she found Sophie sitting in the kitchen, leafing through her literature book, but her eyes were unfocused. Ethan was in his room, engrossed in his usual video games. Emily set her bag down on the table and walked over to her daughter. "How's school going?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Sophie shrugged, not looking up. "Fine. And you? What were you doing in the library for so long?" Emily froze, her fingers gripping the edge of the tabletop. "Just a book club. Nothing special." Sophie finally looked at her, and there was something new in her eyes, not just curiosity, but suspicion. "You've been going places lately, and you're always writing in your notebooks. What are you writing in them, Mom?" Emily felt her heart skip a beat. She forced a smile. "Just a thought, Sophie. You know I've always loved writing." But Sophie didn't back down. "I saw one of your notebooks. It said something about you being tired of pretending. What does that mean? Are you pretending with us?" Emily paled, but quickly pulled herself together. "Sophie, you misunderstood. This is just adult anxiety. You don't need to worry." Sophie pressed her lips together, her gaze hard. "You always say that. But I'm not a child, Mom. I can tell something's wrong. You and Dad barely talk. He sleeps in the spare room. What's going on?" Emily wanted to lie, to say everything was fine, but the words caught in her throat. She knew Sophie was too smart to believe another excuse. "Daddy and we have problems, but we'll figure it out. I promise." Sophie snorted, pushing her textbook away. "Figure it out? How? You're not even trying to talk to each other." She stood up and walked into her room, leaving Emily alone. Meanwhile, Daniel met Martin at a restaurant on the outskirts of town where no one knew them. Martin ordered bourbon, and Daniel stuck to water he needed to keep his head clear. Martin pulled out a folder and slid it toward Daniel. "I talked to a few people in Emily's circle, her former friends, her fellow volunteers. They had some interesting things to say." Daniel frowned as he opened the folder. "What kind of things?" Martin leaned back in his chair. "They say Emily has always been strategic. One of them, Sarah Miller, mentioned that Emily liked to plan ahead even in college. She never makes a move without thinking 10 times ahead," she said. Another friend, Laura Bennett, hinted that Emily may have been planning this divorce for a lot longer than it seems. She mentioned that Emily started asking strange questions a couple of years ago about property division, about custody. Laura thought it was just curiosity, but now. Daniel felt the blood rush to his face. You mean she's been planning this for years? That all this time she's been pretending? Martin shrugged. I don't know, Dan, but it gives us leverage. We can show that her accusations were part of a deliberate plan, not a spontaneous decision. That will weaken her position in court. Daniel shook his head, his fingers tightening around the glass. I can't believe she could do something so cold. We were family. Martin looked at him sympathetically. I know how much this hurts, but you need to focus. If she's playing this game, we need to play better. Daniel returned home late, his mind in turmoil. He walked into the living room where he found Sophie sitting on the couch, using her phone. She looked up, and there was something in her gaze that made him freeze. Dad, can we talk? She asked, her voice quiet but firm. He nodded, sitting down next to her. Of course, sweetie. What happened? Sophie took a deep breath, as if gathering her strength. Mom, she's hiding something. I've asked her about her notebooks, about what's going on, but she keeps avoiding the answer. I don't know if I should believe her. Rain pounded the rooftops of Hartford, turning the streets into mirrors that reflected the lights of passing cars. In the Harper house, only a few windows were lit, creating an illusion of warmth that had long been absent inside. Daniel sat in the spare room that had been converted into his temporary refuge, his laptop open. The screen cast a cold light on his face, highlighting the dark circles under his eyes and the tense lines around his mouth. He hadn't slept well in weeks, and each new day brought only more blows. But today, he felt something, like he was on the edge of an abyss, and he decided to look into it. The last few days had been a whirlwind of meetings with his lawyer, conversations with Sophie, and trying to figure out how to hold together a family that seemed ready to fall apart. Sophie's words about his mother hiding something, and Emily's former friend's hints about her calculating nature had been troubling Daniel. He knew he should trust his instincts, but crossing the line invading Emily's privacy wasn't easy. He was a lawyer, accustomed to ethics, to the law, but now the law seemed like a distant abstraction, unable to protect him from pain. That evening, when Emily had left for another meeting at the library and the kids were busy with their own things, Daniel made a decision. He knew Emily had left her old laptop in the study, not the one she carried with her, but a spare one they used for family business. He wasn't sure he'd find anything important there, but his gut told him it was worth checking. He walked into the study, a small, cozy nook with bookshelves and an old desk that smelled of paper and ink. The laptop was lying on the shelf, slightly dusty, as if it hadn't been touched in a long time. He turned it on, his heart pounding. The screen lit up, and Daniel felt a pang of guilt, but he suppressed it. He knew the password Emily always used Sophie's birthday for things like this. Logging in, he started browsing through the files, but found nothing out of the ordinary. Photos from family vacations, old shopping lists, the kids' school projects. He was about to close the laptop when he noticed an email client icon hidden in a folder called Archive. Daniel clicked on it, and the program opened, showing a list of accounts. One of them caught his eye, an address he had never seen before: emilyhartpriv@gmail.com. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. This wasn't the address Emily used for work or to communicate with friends. He tried to log in, but the password didn't work. After a few failed attempts, he remembered Emily had once mentioned using the title of her favorite book for passwords. He typed Great Gatsby 1E925, and the post office opened. The incoming emails were few and far between, but each one was like a punch to the gut. Most of them were from a woman named Claire Davis, an old friend of Emily's from college, someone Daniel thought she had long since lost touch with. He began to read, and with each word his world crumbled. The first letter, dated 6 months ago, began innocently. Emily, so glad we're back in touch. How are you? You seemed so tired when we spoke on the phone. Tell me what's going on. Emily's answer was long and full of emotion. Claire, I'm at my wit's end. Daniel, he's not a bad man, but I'm suffocating. He decides everything for me, for us. I feel like I don't exist. I've started thinking about divorce, but I don't know how to do it. He's a lawyer, he'll crush me in court. Daniel's jaw clenched, his fingers trembling. He continued reading. The next letters became increasingly revealing. Claire wrote, "If you want to leave, you have to be smarter than him. Judges love dramatic stories. You can say he was emotionally abusive. It's hard to refute that." Emily replied, "But he never yelled at me or humiliated me in public. How can I prove it? Claire, you don't have to prove it. Just convince the judge that you were afraid. Write diaries, write down everything he does, even the little things. Exaggerate if you need to. It works." Daniel felt the blood rush to his face. He kept scrolling, each letter worse than the last. In one, Claire offered, "If things get really bad, you can hint at something more serious, like harassment. You don't have to directly accuse, just throw out the idea. That will make him back off." Emily replied, "I'm not sure I'm ready to go that far, but I'll think about it. I just want him to leave me alone." Daniel pushed himself away from the table, his breathing heavy. He couldn't believe his eyes. Emily, the woman he loved, the woman he shared his life with, was discussing how to fabricate charges against him. He felt betrayed, crushed, and angry at the same time. This wasn't just a divorce, it was a war, and Emily was playing dirty. He took screenshots of the emails, sent them to himself and Martin, then closed the laptop. His hands were shaking, but his mind was cold as steel. He knew these emails could change the course of this case, but the price was high. If he used them, Sophie and Ethan would learn that their mother was capable of lying. He didn't want to destroy their faith in her, but he couldn't let her destroy him. Meanwhile, Emily returned home, her coat damp from the rain. She walked into the kitchen, where she found Sophie sitting at the table with a mug of tea. Sophie looked tense, her fingers nervously fiddling with the pen of her notebook. "Mom, where have you been?" Sophie asked, her voice sharp. Emily took off her coat, trying not to meet her eyes. "In the library. We had a meeting about the fall festival." Sophie narrowed her eyes. "You're always somewhere, and every time I ask, you say it's adult stuff." "I'm not stupid, Mom. I know you and Dad are getting a divorce." Emily froze, her heart clenching. She turned to her daughter, trying to remain calm. "Sophie, yeah, Dad and I are having problems, but we're trying to figure it out." Sophie snorted, her eyes shining with tears. "Deal with it. You won't even talk to him, and I've seen you hiding your notebooks. What's up, Mom? Why do you always hide things?" Emily felt panic rise in her throat. She knew Sophie had seen one of her posts, but she had no idea how deep her daughter was digging. "Sophie, this is personal. You don't need to know everything." "Personal?" Sophie jumped up, her voice breaking. "This is our family, Mom. Do you think I can't see how you've changed? You're always with that lawyer of yours, whispering on the phone. What are you up to?" Emily stepped toward her, her voice firmer. "Sophie, stop. You don't know what you're talking about. I'm doing this for you and Ethan." Sophie shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "For us? Or for yourself? I don't know who to believe, Mom, but I know you're lying." She ran out of the kitchen, leaving Emily alone. Emily sank into a chair, her hands shaking. She knew Sophie was right, she had been hiding too much. But she couldn't tell her daughter the truth, couldn't explain why she felt trapped, why she had chosen this path. She pulled out her phone and texted Claire, "Sophie is starting to get suspicious. I don't know how long I can keep this a secret." The answer came quickly, "Hang in there, Emily. You're doing this for freedom. Don't let her drag you into guilt." The next day, Daniel met with Martin in his office. Martin looked over the screenshots of the emails, his eyebrows rising with each line. "This is dynamite, Dan," he said, putting the papers down. "If we use this, her case will fall apart. The judge will see that she manipulated the facts. But, are you sure you want to go this route? It will blow everything up. Daniel nodded, his face grim. I don't want the children to suffer, but I can't let her lie about me. She's ready to accuse me of harassment, Martin. I can't ignore that. Martin sighed. Okay, we'll start preparing the petition, but you need to be prepared for Emily to strike back. She won't back down. Meanwhile, Sophie, sitting in her room, was searching for answers. She knew she couldn't trust either her mother or her father completely. She opened her laptop and began searching for information about divorce, about emotional abuse, about parents using their children in their games. The more she read, the more anxious she became. She remembered words from her mother's notebook, conversations with friends, and began to suspect that the truth was much more complicated than it seemed. Ethan, as usual, kept to himself, but even he began to notice that his sister had changed. She became quieter, more thoughtful, and one day he found her crying in her room. Sophie, what's wrong? He asked, his voice full of concern. She wiped away her tears, trying to smile. It's okay, Ethan. It's complicated. He frowned. Is it because of Mom and Dad? They fight all the time. Sophie nodded, unsure how to explain. Yes, but I'll figure it out. Don't worry. But Ethan wasn't as naive as she thought. He saw his mom hide her phone. His dad went into his office and did not come out for hours. He didn't know what to do, but he felt like their family was falling apart. Night had fallen over the Harper house, but the silence was deceptive. Daniel lay in the guest room, staring at screenshots of the emails that burned in his mind. Emily sat in the bedroom, rereading the text from Claire, her heart clenching with fear. Sophie wrote in her journal, trying to figure out what was true and what was a lie. Ethan stared at the ceiling, wondering how he could return to the world where everything was simple. The secrets they had been keeping began to surface like the wreckage of a sunken ship, and each of them knew that the next step could be their last, destroying all that remained. Autumn was gathering strength in Hartford, and the trees along the streets were ablaze with crimson and gold. But in the Harper house, the fire was not picturesque, but destructive. 3 weeks had passed since Daniel discovered Emily's secret correspondence, and since then, their lives had become a chessboard where every move was calculated and the pieces were their own children. The home, once full of laughter and warmth, was now an arena where words were weapons and silence a minefield. Each member of the family teetered on the edge, trying to maintain equilibrium in a world that was rapidly collapsing. Emily braced herself like a general preparing for a decisive battle. She knew the custody battle would be tough, and Catherine Wells, her lawyer, kept reminding her that the children were the key to victory. The judge will listen to their views, especially Sophie's, Catherine said, her voice as cold as marble. If they say they want to stay with you, that almost guarantees our success. Emily nodded, but inside she was racked with guilt. She didn't want to drag Sophie and Ethan into this war, but she saw no other way. Daniel was too strong, too stubborn, and she was afraid that without their support, he would crush her in court. Her efforts began subtly. Over dinner, she began talking more with the children about the past, about the times Daniel had been too busy to come to their school concerts or drive them to practice. She didn't accuse him directly, but her words were like drops of water, slowly wearing away at a stone. Remember when Dad promised to take you to that game, Ethan, but he left at the last minute on business? She would say, stirring her soup, her tone soft, almost nostalgic. Ethan would nod, his face darkening, but he wouldn't respond. Sophie, more perceptive, noticed the hints, but didn't know how to respond. She sensed that her mother was trying to impress something upon her, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Emily also began spending more time with her children separately. She played chess with Ethan, praising him for every move but casually mentioning how Dad always put work first. With Sophie, she shared stories about her youth, how she had dreamed of being a writer, but life turned out differently. These conversations were subtle, almost unnoticeable, but they sowed seeds of doubt. Emily knew Sophie already suspected her of being secretive, so she tried to be careful, but the pressure of the trial and the fear of losing pushed her to take risks. Daniel, for his part, felt the children growing distant. Sophie, who used to come to him for advice on her studies, now avoided his gaze. Ethan, who had always been so open, became more silent, hiding behind his games. Daniel tried to establish contact. He invited Sophie to go to a cafe, Ethan to play basketball, but their answers were short, evasive. He suspected that Emily was turning them against him, but there was no evidence. The letters he had found had already been given to Martin, who was preparing them for trial, but Daniel did not want to use them until he was sure there was no other way out. He was afraid that the truth about Emily's manipulations would break the children's hearts. The trial began in the gray Hartford County Courthouse, where the smell of old wood and coffee mingled with the tension in the air. The courtroom was small, with tall windows that let in pale light. The judge, a middle-aged woman named Elizabeth Crow, looked at the participants with a tired sternness, as if she had seen hundreds of cases like this before. Daniel sat next to Martin, his suit impeccable, but his fingers fiddling nervously with his pen. Emily, by contrast, looked composed, her attorney, Catherine Wells, exuding confidence as she leafed through a file. The first day was filled with formalities: the announcement of claims, the presentation of evidence, the discussion of property. But the most difficult moment was the appointment of a psychological assessment for the children. Judge Crow insisted that Sophie and Ethan speak to an independent psychologist to determine who they wanted to live with. Daniel felt a pang of fear. He knew Emily had spent more time with the children in recent weeks, and he feared that her influence had become entrenched. The psychologist, Dr. Laura Green, was a soft-spoken woman with piercing eyes. Her office in downtown Hartford was cozy, with warm beige walls and shelves filled with books on child psychology. On the desk was a box of crayons and sheets of paper, as if that might soften the weight of the conversation ahead. Sophie walked in first, her shoulders tense and her arms crossed over her chest. She sat in a chair, avoiding Dr. Green's gaze. "Sophie, I'm here to listen to you," Laura began, her voice calm but not condescending. "You can say anything you think. This is a safe place." Sophie nodded, but her lips were pressed tightly together. She knew this conversation would affect the court's decision, and she felt like a puppet being pulled in different directions. I don't know what to say," she muttered, looking at the floor. Laura leaned a little closer, her tone soft. "Let's start with the simple stuff. How do you feel at home, with Mom and Dad?" Sophie swallowed, her fingers tightening on the edge of her chair. She remembered her conversations with her mother, her hints that Dad was pressuring her, all of them. She remembered her mother holding her, saying, "You want us to be happy, don't you?" The words echoed in her head, but something about them felt wrong. "At home, it's tense," she said finally. "They don't talk. Dad sleeps in the other room. Mom, she says Dad was too strict, that he was controlling." Laura wrote something down in her notebook, her face neutral. "What do you think? Do you feel like Dad was strict with you?" Sophie hesitated. She remembered her father teaching her to drive, patiently explaining algebra to her, laughing when they watched old comedies. But then her mother's words came back to her. "He always made decisions for us, Sophie. That's not normal." She felt her throat tighten. "Sometimes he was strict. For example, he always wanted me to do my homework right after school, and he didn't like it when I argued with him." Laura nodded, but her eyes were watching Sophie. She noticed the way the girl looked away, the way her voice trembled, as if she were repeating someone else's words. "What do you feel about Daddy? Are you afraid of him?" Sophie froze. The word scared cut her like a knife. She knew her mother wanted her to say yes, but the truth was different. "No," she said quietly. "I'm not scared of him. He's just Dad. But Mama says he was bad for her, and I don't know who to believe." Laura made another note, her pencil moving slowly, as if she were weighing each word. "And how is it with Mom? Do you feel comfortable with her?" Sophie nodded, but her movements were unsure. "Mom, she's always there. She takes care of us. But she's changed. She's always hiding things. I've seen her whispering on the phone, hiding her notebooks. I don't know what she does." Laura put her notebook down, her gaze softening. "Sophie, it's hard when your parents fight, but I want you to know that you don't have to pick sides. Just say what you feel." Sophie nodded, but tears were already streaming down her cheeks. She felt like a traitor talking about her mother, but at the same time she couldn't lie. She wanted to scream that she was tired of this, that she wanted everything to go back to normal, but instead she simply wiped away her tears and said, "I just want them to stop fighting." As Sophie left the office, Laura wrote in her report, "Child shows signs of emotional distress. Her words about dislike for father sound rehearsed, possibly influenced by mother. Further assessment required." She knew this report would carry weight in court, and she felt the weight of her responsibility. Ethan, whose turn it was next, walked into the office with his head down. He was quieter than Sophie, and his answers were shorter. "Dad's okay," he said when Laura asked about Daniel. "He just works a lot. Mom says he didn't spend time with us, but he always took me to chess." His voice was even, but Laura noticed the way he clasped his hands, as if trying to contain his emotions. When Laura asked about his mother, Ethan hesitated. "She's nice, but she's sad all the time, and she says Dad made her that way. I don't know if that's true." Laura noted that Ethan, like Sophie, seemed confused, caught between two versions of the truth. In court, the custody battle was gathering momentum. Catherine Wells presented Emily's diaries, in which she described how Daniel had overpowered her, ignored her wishes, and controlled their lives. She also brought in accounts from Emily's friends, who attested to her emotional exhaustion. Martin, for his part, began to carefully introduce Emily's correspondence with Claire, hinting that the charges might be fabricated. He hadn't yet revealed all his cards, but his questions to the witnesses were razor sharp, and they were making Emily nervous. Daniel tried to keep his cool, but every day in court was a blow. He could see Sophie and Ethan looking at him from afar, their faces full of confusion. He wanted to hug them, to tell them everything would be okay, but he knew words meant nothing now. Emily, sitting on the other side of the courtroom, avoided his gaze, but her posture was tense, as if she were bracing herself for the next blow. That evening, after another meeting, Daniel found Sophie in her room. She was sitting on her bed, hugging her knees. "Dad, why is everything so complicated?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He sat down next to her, trying not to show his pain. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I promise I'll do everything I can to protect you and Ethan." She looked at him, her eyes full of tears. "Mom says you were bad for her, but I don't want to believe it. Why does she say that?" Daniel swallowed, his heart breaking. I wasn't perfect, Sophie, but I loved her, and I love you. Sometimes people see things differently." Sophie nodded, but her eyes were full of doubt. She felt manipulated by her mother, but she couldn't help but feel guilty for doubting her. Emily, meanwhile, sat in the bedroom, rereading the message from Claire. "Hang in there, Emily. Having the kids on your side is your trump card. Just keep reminding them who's been there for you all these years." She knew Claire was right, but every time she saw the pain in Sophie's eyes or the confusion in Ethan, her resolve weakened. She wanted freedom, but not at this price. Night fell on Hartford, and the Harper household was silent. But it was not the silence of peace, but the calm before a new storm. The children, unwitting weapons in this war, bore the burden of others' mistakes, and each member of the family knew that the next step could be decisive or devastating. Winter had crept up on Hartford, blanketing the city in a thin layer of frost that glittered under the streetlights like a scattering of diamonds. But in the county courtroom where the battle for the Harper family's future was ongoing, there was nothing glittery, only the cold reality of legal battles, where every word carried the weight of a sentence. Daniel Harper, once a confident lawyer accustomed to winning corporate disputes, was now fighting for his life, his family, his reputation. He felt like a gladiator thrown into an arena where the enemy, his own wife, was far more cunning than he could have imagined. It had been a month since the trial began, and each day brought new wounds. Emily, led by her shark-like lawyer, Catherine Wells, continued to build her case on allegations of emotional abuse, backed up by diaries, testimonies from friends, and psychological reports that painted Daniel as a man who had crushed her will. Sophie and Ethan, whose words in psychologist Laura Green's office were part of the case, seemed like pawns in this game, their voices drowned out by the adults who were deciding their fates. Daniel knew he had to fight back, but every step was difficult not because of a lack of resources, but because of the pain he felt as he destroyed Emily's image in the eyes of the children. His lawyer, Martin Craig, knew this was a case that required more than just a defense. That evening, in his office, which smelled of leather and old books, he laid out a plan for Daniel. "We can't just deny her allegations," Martin said, drumming his fingers on the table. "We need to seize the initiative. I've assembled a team, 2 junior lawyers to analyze the documents, a private investigator to find new evidence, and a psychological expert to challenge Laura Green's report. But you have to make up your mind, Dan. If we use the correspondence with Claire and other evidence, it will be like a nuclear strike. Are you ready?" Daniel looked at the picture of Sophie and Ethan on Martin's desk, a gift from him last Christmas. His throat tightened, but he nodded. "I don't want them to hate their mother, but I can't let her destroy me. Do what you have to do." Martin took action. He hired a private investigator, Ron Keller, a man with a reputation for finding a needle in a haystack. Ron, a former cop with graying temples and a habit of chewing on a toothpick, dug deep. He started with Emily's finances, suspecting that her demand for 70% of the estate was no accident. A week later, he came to Martin with a discovery that took Daniel's breath away. Emily had opened a Swiss bank account 2 years earlier, into which small sums from her personal savings had been regularly transferred. The amounts were modest, but their origin was unclear. They did not correspond to her income from volunteer work or the family budget. "That's not all," Ron said, handing over a folder of printouts. "I checked her travel records for the last 3 years. She flew to New York several times, supposedly for literary conferences, but I found correspondence with someone named James Reed, a freelance journalist. They met in hotels. I have receipts and security footage." Daniel felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He picked up the folder, his fingers shaking. The photographs showed Emily entering the Plaza Hotel with a man tall, with dark hair and a casual smile. The correspondence Ron had obtained was brief but unambiguous. "I can't wait to see you again, Em. You make me feel alive." James wrote. Emily's response was reserved but warm. "You know how difficult this is for me, but I'm waiting too." Daniel closed the folder, his face pale. "She cheated on me," he said quietly, as if tasting the words. "All these years, while I worked, while I tried for my family, she lied." Martin put a hand on his shoulder. "I know how much this hurts, Dan, but this is our chance. We can show that her accusations are an attempt to divert attention from her own misdeeds. It will weaken her position." But that wasn't the only blow. A few days later, Martin received a visit from Sarah Miller, Emily's former friend, whose hints had already made Daniel suspect his wife's calculations. Sarah, dressed in a suit, sat in Martin's office, nervously fiddling with a strap of her bag. "I don't want to get involved in this," she began, her voice shaking. "But I can't keep quiet any longer. Emily, she's not who she says she is." Sarah said Emily had started talking to her about divorce 3 years ago. "She said she was tired of Daniel, that he was suffocating her," Sarah said, looking at the floor. "But then she started asking questions about money, how things were divided, how to get the most out of it. I thought she was just curious, but she was obsessive. She mentioned wanting to provide for herself, that Daniel was too rich to just leave. I didn't think she'd go that far." Martin wrote down every word, his eyes shining. "Are you prepared to repeat this in court?" he asked. Sarah swallowed but nodded. "Yes, I can't watch her ruin his life for money." Daniel felt a mixture of relief and rage when he learned this. Sarah was confirming his worst suspicions, but the truth was bitter. Emily, the woman he loved, had not simply planned the divorce, she had constructed it as a financial strategy, using the children, his reputation, and their family as leverage. Meanwhile, Emily continued to strengthen her position. She didn't know about Ron's findings or Sarah's decision, but she sensed that Daniel was up to something big. Catherine Wells warned her that he might strike back, so Emily increased the pressure on the children. She began to talk more with Ethan about how his dad never understood his interests, and with Sophie about how Daniel limited her dreams. But Sophie, already suspicious of the lie, became increasingly withdrawn. She began to avoid talking to her mother, spending time in her room, where she wrote in her diary, "I don't know who to believe. Mom says one thing, Dad says another. But I see the way she looks at me, like she's waiting for me to say what she needs. It's scary." Ethan, less perceptive but sensitive, also began to notice oddities. One day, he found his mother's phone unattended in the living room. On the screen was a message from Claire: "Remind the kids how Daniel ignored them. It will work in court." Ethan didn't understand everything, but the words "works in court" stuck in his head. He didn't tell Sophie, but he became quieter, more thoughtful. The case was gathering momentum in court. Martin introduced a new witness, Dr. Andrew Carter, a psychologist with 20 years' experience, who challenged Laura Green's report. Carter argued that Sophie and Ethan's words about disliking their father sounded rehearsed, indicating that their mother might be influencing them. He also noted that the children were showing signs of emotional distress, caused not by their father's behavior, but by the conflict between their parents. This prompted a storm of objections from Catherine, but Judge Crow listened attentively, taking notes. Martin then began to introduce evidence against Emily. He presented excerpts from her correspondence with Claire, discussing manipulation and possible false accusations. Catherine tried to challenge their authenticity, but Martin was prepared. He produced certified copies obtained by Ron through legal channels. The room became noisy, and Emily, sitting at the table, turned pale. She looked at Daniel, but his gaze was cold, impenetrable. But the hardest blow came from Sarah Miller. She walked into the courtroom, her steps firm, but her eyes avoided Emily. Under oath, Sarah repeated her story: how Emily had been planning the divorce for years, how she had inquired about finances, how she had spoken of the need to provide for herself. "I thought she was just unhappy," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "But then I realized she didn't just want to leave. She wanted to take everything." Catherine tried to discredit Sarah, accusing her of jealousy and personal animosity, but Sarah held firm. Judge Crow looked at Emily, and there was doubt in her eyes. Daniel felt the scales beginning to tip in his favor, but there was no joy, only emptiness. After the hearing, Emily returned home, her hands shaking as she took off her coat. She knew the case was falling apart. Catherine tried to reassure her, but even she acknowledged that Sarah's testimony and the correspondence with Claire had dealt a serious blow. Emily sat in the kitchen, staring at the empty table, and for the first time in months, she felt out of control. She wrote to Claire, "Everything is falling apart. Sarah betrayed me. What should I do?" But there was no answer. Sophie came home from school to find her mother in this state. "Mom, what happened?" she asked, her voice full of worry. Emily forced a smile. "It's nothing, honey, just a rough day." But Sophie didn't believe it. She saw her mother hiding the phone, her eyes darting. "It's because of the trial, right? Why don't you tell the truth?" Emily stood up, her voice sharp. "Sophie, stop. You don't know what you're talking about." Sophie pulled back, her eyes filling with tears. "I understand more than you think. You're lying, Mom, and I'm tired of it." She walked into her room, slamming the door. Ethan, who had heard their conversation, walked silently to his room. He took out a chessboard, but did not play. He simply looked at the pieces, thinking about how his family had become a game where all the moves were wrong. Daniel came home late, his face tired but determined. He went into the spare room where he kept the folder of evidence. He knew that the next step, providing evidence of Emily's infidelities and her Swiss account, could be the final blow. But he wasn't sure he wanted that. He thought about Sophie, about Ethan, about how they would live with the knowledge that their mother had deceived them all. Night fell over Hartford, and the Harper household fell silent. But it was the silence before the storm, as everyone braced for the next blow. Daniel gathered the strength to protect himself. Emily clung to the remains of her plan, feeling it crumble. Sophie and Ethan, confused and wounded, searched for truth in a world where it seemed there was none. The war was approaching its climax, and no one knew who would be left standing in the rubble. The Hartford County courtroom was charged with a tension that was almost tangible, like static electricity before a thunderstorm. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, reflecting off the polished wooden benches, but bringing no warmth to the cold atmosphere of the trial. Judge Elizabeth Crowe, a woman with a face chiseled from granite, sat at her desk, her eyes watching every move of the lawyers, witnesses, and litigants. This was a pivotal day, the culmination of months of preparation, accusations, and counterarguments in what had become a legal war against the Harpers. Daniel Harper sat on the left, next to Martin Craig, his lawyer, whose confidence was a beacon in this storm. His suit was as immaculate as ever, but there were shadows under his eyes from sleepless nights, and his fingers clutching his pen nervously, betraying his inner turmoil. Across the table from him, Emily Harper looked composed, but her pallor and the tenseness of her shoulders suggested that she was struggling to maintain her calm. Catherine Wells, her lawyer, sat next to him, her sharp eyes darting between the judge and her file, bracing herself for the next blow. Sophie and Ethan were not present. The judge had insisted that the children avoid the courtroom, but their shadows hovered over the proceedings like ghosts, reminding everyone that not only property was at stake, but their futures. The hearing began with Catherine Wells speaking. She stood, her voice clear, but with a dramatic edge calculated to offend the judge. "Your Honor," she began, "we present a case about a woman who endured years of emotional domination, control, and mental abuse at the hands of her husband, Daniel Harper. Emily Harper was forced to live in the shadow of his ambitions, her voice silenced, her dreams ignored. She asks not just for a divorce, but for justice, full custody of the children who need her care, and an order of property that will allow her to start anew after years of oppression." Catherine produced Emily's diaries, in which she described her feelings of loneliness and pressure. She read passages in which Daniel allegedly criticized her for not being able to cope with household chores or for being too emotional. She then called two of Emily's friends as witnesses, who confirmed that she had often complained about her husband's coldness and his authoritarian approach. One, Lisa Thompson, described, her voice shaking, how Emily had cried in her kitchen, saying that Daniel made her feel worthless. Catherine skillfully steered their testimony, creating a picture of Daniel as a man who systematically destroyed his wife's self-esteem. But the hardest part was the presentation of Laura Green's psychological report. Catherine read out excerpts that said Sophie and Ethan had expressed discomfort in their father's presence, that their comments about his strictness indicated emotional distress. The children, Catherine stressed, deserve to live with a mother who always puts them first, as opposed to a father whose career was a priority. She looked at Daniel, her gaze challenging. Daniel felt anger rise in his chest, but Martin put a hand on his shoulder, whispering, "Hold on, it's our turn." Martin stood up, his posture calm but his eyes blazing. He began by challenging the veracity of Emily's journals. "Your Honor," he said, "these entries introduced into evidence are not time-stamped or independently corroborated. They may have been written backdated to manipulate the court." He called a document expert, Dr. Allison Brooks, who confirmed that the ink and paper in some of the entries were different, indicating that the text may have been added later. Martin then moved on to Emily's correspondence with Claire Davis. He produced certified copies of letters in which Emily discussed how to exaggerate allegations of emotional abuse and even hinted at possible false allegations of harassment. The room fell silent as Martin read the lines. "If things get really bad, you can hint at something more serious. That will make him back off." Catherine jumped in, arguing that the letters had been obtained illegally, but Martin was prepared. He had provided evidence that the emails had been accessed via the family laptop, which was in common use. Judge Crowe frowned, but allowed the case to continue. The next blow came when Sarah Miller spoke. She walked into the room with her head held high, but her hands shook as she swore to tell the truth. Emily started talking about divorce 3 years ago, Sarah said, her voice even but tense. She was asking about dividing up her assets, getting the most she could. She said Daniel was too rich to just walk away. I thought she was just unhappy, but then I realized it was a plan. Catherine tried to discredit Sarah, accusing her of holding a personal grudge, but Sarah held firm, her words hanging in the air like an accusation. Martin didn't stop there. He called in Dr. Andrew Carter, a psychologist who had challenged Laura Green's account. Carter said Sophie and Ethan's dislike of their father sounded rehearsed, suggesting that their mother was probably influencing them. Children are under a lot of emotional pressure, he said, his voice calm but firm. Their responses reflect not their own feelings, but what they have been taught. He presented an analysis showing that Sophie showed signs of conflicting loyalties and Ethan was too withdrawn to express genuine emotion. But the most devastating blow came from the evidence of Emily's infidelities. Martin presented hotel receipts, CCTV footage, and correspondence with James Reed. He did not read out intimate details, but he emphasized that Emily had led a double life, hiding her actions from her family. Your Honor, he said, the plaintiff claims to have been a victim of emotional abuse, but her own behavior, the infidelities, the secret accounts, the manipulation of her children speaks differently. This is not a victim, but a person who deliberately destroyed a family for personal gain. Emily sat still, her face a mask, but her fingers gripping the edge of the table gave her away. She felt the walls crumbling. Catherine whispered something to her, but Emily barely heard it. She knew that the truth about her affair with James and the Swiss account would destroy her reputation in the eyes of the judge, and perhaps the children as well. She wanted to scream that it was all wrong, that she was seeking comfort because she felt alone, but she knew it didn't matter. The court did not forgive lies. The court adjourned for a break, and Daniel stepped out into the hallway, his heart pounding. He watched Emily walk into the consultation room with Catherine, her steps quick, almost panicked. He wanted to feel satisfied, but instead he felt empty. Winning the trial wouldn't bring back his family, wouldn't erase Sophie and Ethan's pain, wouldn't bring back the years he'd thought were happy. Meanwhile, Sophie sat in the school library, skipping class to avoid her classmates' questions. She knew it was a big day in court, and her stomach clenched with dread. She tried to write in her journal, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she opened her laptop and began searching for information about divorce, about how the courts decided who the children would live with. The articles terrified her. Stories of families torn apart, of children losing contact with one parent. She remembered the psychologist's words, her own answers, and felt guilt tighten in her chest. She didn't want to talk badly about her dad, but her mom had asked her so persistently to be honest that she had given in. Ethan, meanwhile, was at home playing chess with himself. He hadn't gone to school, citing a headache, but the truth was he couldn't stand the pitying looks his teachers gave him. He thought about the message he'd seen on his mother's phone about Claire's words, remind the kids how Daniel ignored them. He didn't know what it meant, but he felt like his mother was trying to make him a pawn in her game. He loved her, but doubt was growing in his heart like a crack in glass. That evening, after the trial, Daniel returned home, his shoulders slumped as if he were carrying an invisible weight. He found Sophie in the living room, sitting with a book but not reading. "Dad, how was the trial?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. Daniel sat down next to her, trying to find the words. "It's complicated, honey. We're trying to figure it out, but it's not easy. I want you to know that I'm not fighting against Mom. I'm fighting for you and Ethan." Sophie nodded, but her eyes were full of tears. "I don't want to choose, Dad. I don't want either of you to lose." He hugged her, feeling his own heart break. "I know, Sophie. I know." Emily returned later, her face pale, her eyes red. She walked into the bedroom without saying a word and closed the door. She opened her laptop and wrote to Claire, "Everything is falling apart. They know about James, about the score. I don't know how to continue." Claire answered quickly, "Hang in there, Emily." You can still win. Focus on the kids. But Emily felt that she was losing not only the business, but herself. The conflict had reached its peak, and the courtroom had become an arena where truth and lies collided with deafening force. Armed with evidence, Daniel was ready to strike the final blow, but he knew the price would be high. Emily, cornered, clung to the remnants of her plan, but the cracks in her facade were widening. Sophie and Ethan, unwitting participants in this war, sought a way to survive amid the rubble. The trial continued, and no one knew what verdict awaited them. Winter had reached its apex in Hartford, and the city was buried in snowdrifts that sparkled in the few rays of sunlight that broke through the heavy gray clouds. But in the county courtroom, where the Harpers' case was being concluded, there was no light, no warmth, only the cold clarity of justice that had sliced through their lives like a scalpel, leaving scars that would never heal. As Judge Elizabeth Crowe, her eyes a mirror of weariness and impartiality from months of hearings, prepared to deliver her decision, everyone in the courtroom felt the air thicken with anticipation. Daniel Harper sat at the table next to Martin Craig, his lawyer, whose confidence failed to hide the strain he was feeling. Daniel looked haggard, his cheeks sunken, his suit, which had always fitted him perfectly, now slightly too big, as if he had lost not only weight, but also part of himself. Emily Harper, on the other hand, sat up straight, but her hands, clasped on the edge of the table, betrayed the turmoil within her. Catherine Wells, her lawyer, maintained a professional composure, but even she knew that the case was slipping through their fingers. The courtroom was full, with journalists, family friends, and curious acquaintances all waiting for the verdict that would determine the fate of the once model family. Judge Crowe adjusted her glasses and began to speak, her voice steady, but each word falling like a stone in water, creating ripples that affected everyone in the room. After careful consideration of the evidence, witness statements, and psychological reports, she began, the court has reached the following findings. The allegations of emotional abuse by Daniel Harper are not supported by sufficient evidence. Emily Harper's correspondence with Claire Davis, as well as the evidence of Sarah Miller, indicate that the allegations were fabricated in part to gain financial and legal advantage. The room began to buzz, but the judge raised her hand in silence. Emily paled, her fingers tightening, and Catherine whispered something to calm her. Daniel stared straight ahead, his face unmoving, but inside he felt a mixture of relief and pain. He hadn't wanted this, he hadn't wanted Emily to be publicly humiliated, but she had chosen this path. The judge continued, however, the court finds that both parents made mistakes that resulted in emotional distress for the children. Based on the psychological reports and testimony of Sophie and Ethan Harper, the court orders that full custody of the children should not be awarded to Emily Harper. Instead, joint custody is awarded, with primary custody of the children to Daniel Harper given his stable emotional state and the absence of evidence of manipulative behavior. Emily Harper is entitled to regular visits, which will be supervised by a social worker for the first 6 months. Emily closed her eyes, her breathing coming in ragged gasps. She felt the world crumbling. Joint custody was better than nothing, but losing primary custody of the children was like a blow to her heart. She wanted to scream that it wasn't fair, that she had done everything for them, but she knew her words meant nothing now. With respect to the division of assets, the judge continued, the court rejects Emily Harper's claim for 70% of the assets. Given the evidence of her financial manipulations, including the secret Swiss bank account, as well as the fact of adultery, the assets will be divided equally, with the exception of the funds in the said account, which are subject to further investigation by the tax authorities. The room buzzed louder, and the reporters began taking notes feverishly. Emily felt her cheeks heat up. She knew that news of the bill and her connection to James Reed had already leaked to the local media, but now it was official. Her reputation, which she had carefully built over the years, was in ruins. The judge concluded, I urge both parties to keep the welfare of Sophie and Ethan in mind. This process has caused them significant emotional harm, and I strongly recommend family therapy for all members of the family. She banged her gavel, and the hearing was over. Daniel stood up, his legs weak. Martin clapped him on the shoulder, whispering, "We did it, Dan." But Daniel felt no joy. He had won, but it was a bitter victory. He looked at Emily, who sat with her head down, and for a moment he wanted to go to her, to tell her that he hadn't meant to do this. But he knew there was no turning back. Emily walked out of the room, not looking at the reporters who surrounded her, shouting questions. "Mrs. Harper, is it true that you were planning a divorce for money?" "What about your affair?" She walked past silently, her heels clicking on the marble floor, but inside she felt everything she had built crumbling. Catherine tried to walk alongside her, but Emily waved her away. She wanted to be alone. By evening, news of the Harper case was in local newspapers and on websites. The headlines were relentless. Lawyer's wife caught manipulating, cheating, Hartford scandal, diaries reveal divorce plots for money. Someone in the press had gotten access to the excerpts from Emily's diaries that Catherine had used in court, and they were published, distorted, and taken out of context. One article quoted the line, "I'm tired of being a shadow, but I'll find a way to take my place." Readers interpreted this as evidence of her greed, even though Emily wrote these words in a moment of despair when she felt invisible in her own marriage. Emily returned home, but the house no longer felt like hers. Sophie and Ethan were at Daniel's. The judge had ruled that they would spend the next few weeks with him until a visiting schedule could be worked out. She sat in the kitchen, looking at the empty table where the family had once gathered. Her phone buzzed with messages, friends, acquaintances, even distant relatives writing to express sympathy or, conversely, condemnation. She didn't respond. Instead, she opened her laptop and began writing a letter to Claire. "It's over. I lost my kids, my reputation, everything. You said it would work, but I'm left with nothing." But she didn't send it. Instead, she deleted the message and closed her laptop, feeling the loneliness squeeze her like a vice. Daniel, meanwhile, was in his house, now officially his, according to the court's ruling. Sophie and Ethan were sitting in the living room, but the atmosphere was heavy. Sophie was leafing through a book, but her eyes were distant. Ethan was fiddling with a chessboard, but he hadn't started a game. Daniel sat down next to them, trying to find the words. "Guys," he began, his voice soft, "I know this is hard, but we're going to get through this. We're a family." Sophie looked at him, her eyes full of pain. "Family? Dad, Mom hates us now. I saw the news. They call her a liar, a cheat. How can we be a family after that?" Daniel swallowed, his heart clenching. "Sophie, I didn't mean for this to happen. But I had to protect you. Mom made mistakes, but she loves you." Ethan looked up, his voice quiet. "Then why did she lie? I saw her phone. She texted that woman, Claire, to remind us how you ignored us. Is that true?" Daniel felt his throat tighten. He wanted to lie, to say it was all a misunderstanding, but he knew the truth was already out. "Ethan, I wasn't a perfect father. I worked hard, sometimes too hard, but I always tried to be there for you. Mom, she was desperate. Sometimes people do the wrong things when they're hurting." Sophie stood up, her hands shaking. "I don't want to hate her, Dad, but I don't know how to trust her after all this." She went to her room, and Daniel didn't stop her. He knew she needed time. Ethan remained looking at the chessboard. "Dad, are we going to live with you now?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Daniel nodded. "Yes, but you will see Mom. I don't want you to lose her." Ethan nodded silently, but his eyes were full of confusion. He began to set up the pieces, but the game was not going well. The next day, Daniel took the children to a family therapist, as the judge had recommended. Dr. Anna Rivera, a woman with a warm smile and a good listener, began working with Sophie and Ethan, helping them sort through their feelings. Sophie talked about her anger and betrayal, Ethan about his fear that the family would never be the same. Daniel attended sessions too, trying to figure out how to be a father in a new reality where their home was divided not only by walls, but also by truth. Emily, meanwhile, had moved into a small apartment in downtown Hartford. The house had been left to Daniel, and she couldn't afford to fight for it. Her reputation was in tatters. Local gossip and newspaper articles had made her an outcast. Friends who had once supported her now avoided her, and the library book club forgot to invite her to its next meeting. She tried to contact Sophie and Ethan, but their responses were short, reserved. She knew they'd seen the news, knew about her journals, about James, about the bill. She wanted to explain that her actions were not out of greed, but out of desperation, but the words rang hollow even to her. One evening, sitting in her empty apartment, Emily opened one of her old journals. She reread the entries that had once been her refuge, but now seemed foreign. She wrote a new line: "I wanted freedom, but I lost everything I loved." She closed the journal and cried, allowing herself to feel pain for the first time in months, rather than hiding behind anger or plans. Daniel, despite his victory, didn't feel like a winner. He tried to reconnect with his children, spending evenings with them, helping Sophie with her college essay, playing chess with Ethan. But every look, every silence, reminded him that the family he knew was gone. He thought about asking Emily to meet, to talk without lawyers, but he knew the time was not right. Sophie began writing letters to her mother, but she didn't send them. In them, she poured out her pain, her questions, her love that she couldn't express out loud. Ethan, more withdrawn, kept his feelings inside, but one day he drew a chessboard where the white and black pieces stood mixed up, without rules, without order. Winter continued in Hartford, and snow covered the streets like a shroud, hiding the city's wounds. The Harper house stood empty, its windows dark, but echoes of their past still lingered inside. Daniel, Sophie, and Ethan tried to build a new life by holding on to each other, but Emily's shadow was everywhere. Emily, alone in her apartment, searched for a way to atone for her mistakes, but she didn't know where to start. The consequences of the trial were not only legal, they tore their family apart, leaving everyone to find their own way through the rubble. Spring 2026 came timidly to Hartford, as if hesitant to break the winter silence that had ruled the city for so long. Thin green shoots pushed through the thawed earth, and the air was filled with the scent of damp soil and blooming magnolias. For Daniel Harper, standing on the threshold of a new stage in his life, this spring became a symbol not only of nature's rebirth, but also of his own path to healing. A year had passed since the verdict that had destroyed their family, but left him with hope for a future with Sophie and Ethan. Now, amid the rubble of the past, he sought a way to build something new, not just for himself, but for his children, whose hearts still bore the scars of the war that had raged between their parents. The Harper house, once a shining symbol of their prosperity, now seemed like a ghost of a former life. Its white walls were slightly faded, and the garden that Emily loved so much was overgrown with weeds, as if reflecting the neglect that had reigned in their family. Daniel decided to sell it not out of financial necessity, but out of a desire to leave the past behind. He knew that every corner of the house held memories. Sophie's laughter when she learned to ride a bike in the yard, quiet evenings with Emily by the fire, Ethan's first steps on wooden floors. But those same walls also remembered the arguments, the betrayals, the pain that almost destroyed them all. A new home, small but cozy, was waiting for them a few miles away, in a neighborhood where no one knew their history, where they could start over with a clean slate. Daniel stood in his office, gathering the last of his things. His law books were already packed away in boxes, but his laptop sat on his desk, open to the draft of the manuscript that had become his refuge in recent months. After the trial, as the dust settled and the wounds began to heal, he felt the need to process what he had experienced. He began writing, not for the public, but for himself, to understand how the woman he loved had managed to turn their marriage into a battleground. Over time, those notes became a book: Shadows of Control, Psychological Abuse by Women. It wasn't an indictment of Emily or a vendetta. Daniel wanted to tell a story that was rarely told in a society that often views women as victims of manipulation. He described how subtle, almost imperceptible actions, lies, manipulation, the use of children can ruin a man's life, leaving him feeling guilty for something he didn't do. Writing became Daniel's therapy. He worked on the book at night while Sophie and Ethan slept, sitting in the quiet of the guest room that never became his real home. He analyzed their marriage, remembering the moments when Emily had subtly eroded his confidence. Her comments about his coldness, her refusal to discuss problems, her journals that turned out to be as much a tool for judgment as a cry for forgiveness. He consulted psychologists, including Dr. Anna Rivera, their couple's therapist, to understand the mechanisms of psychological abuse. Anna helped him see how Emily had used his sense of duty and love to manipulate him, and how he had unknowingly allowed it to happen. The book was nearly finished, and Daniel was already in talks with a small publisher in Boston. He wasn't looking for fame or fortune. He wanted his story to help other men in similar situations understand that they weren't alone. He also hoped that Sophie and Ethan would read his work when they grew up and understand why their family had fallen apart, why he had fought so hard to keep it together. Sophie, who had just turned 17, stood in her room, packing away the last of the boxes. Her room, once decorated with garlands and watercolors, was now almost empty, and it filled her with an odd mixture of sadness and relief. She sorted through old photographs, school notebooks, letters she had never sent to her mother. In the years since the trial, her relationship with Emily had remained strained. Emily called regularly, sent texts, but Sophie responded with reserve, unsure how to bridge the gap created by lies and public shame. She had seen how her mother had changed. Emily was no longer the confident woman who ran the book club or hosted barbecues. She seemed quieter now, almost broken, but Sophie could not forget the correspondence with Claire, the diaries that had leaked to the media, the words that had hurt her more than she could express. In family therapy, Sophie began to talk about her pain, but the process was slow. Dr. Rivera helped her understand that she could love her mother without making excuses for her actions. Sophie tried to forgive, but every time she saw articles online or heard neighbors whisper, the anger flared up again. She knew Emily had moved into a small apartment, started working at a bookstore, and was trying to rebuild her life, but Sophie wasn't ready for intimacy. She wrote in her journal, "I want my mom to just be my mom, not the one who lied. But I don't know how to do that." Ethan, 13, was less inclined to analyze his feelings, but his pain was expressed in silence. He spent hours playing chess or video games, escaping into worlds where the rules were clear and betrayal did not exist. He saw his mother every 2 weeks, as the court ordered, but their meetings were awkward. Emily tried to talk to him about school, about chess, but Ethan answered in monosyllables, averting his eyes. He remembered the text message he had seen on her phone, and that memory became a barrier he could not overcome. In therapy, he said little, but one day he confessed to Anna, "I don't want my mother to think I hate her, but I don't know how to talk to her." Daniel tried to be a support system for his children, as well as a father. He cut back on his office hours to spend more time with them. In the evenings, they cooked dinner together. Sophie learned how to make pesto pasta, and Ethan, to everyone's surprise, turned out to be a master at baking cupcakes. These moments, simple and warm, were like shoots breaking through the ashes of their past. Daniel took Ethan to chess tournaments and Sophie to exhibitions at a local gallery, where she began to rekindle her love of painting. He listened to them when they wanted to talk, and kept quiet when they needed silence. He knew their wounds would not heal quickly, but he trusted that time and love would do the trick. Emily, living in her apartment, tried to make sense of her new reality. The public shame caused by the leak of her diaries had made her an outcast in Hartford. She quit her job at the library, unable to bear the sidelong glances of her co-workers, and took a job at a bookstore where no one knew her. The job was quiet, allowing her to escape into the world of books that had once been her passion. She began writing again, not diaries, but short stories about women finding themselves after falling. She showed them to no one, but the writing became her way of coping with her guilt and loneliness. Emily saw Sophie and Ethan regularly, but their visits were supervised by a social worker, as ordered by the court. She brought them books and cookies, tried to joke, but she felt their eyes slipping away. She wrote them letters, but only sent 1 in 10, afraid they wouldn't want to read them. In one unsent letter, she wrote, "I don't expect you to forgive me now, but I hope that one day you will understand that I loved you even when I made mistakes." She knew that her path to their hearts would be long, but she was ready to wait. On the last day before the move, Daniel gathered the kids in the living room of the old house. The boxes were already in the truck, and the rooms felt strangely empty, their voices echoing off the walls. "Guys," he began, sitting down on the couch, "I know this year has been tough, but I want you to know that wherever we go, we're in this together, and that's the most important thing." Sophie nodded, her eyes shining. "I just want things to be normal. Not like before, but better." Ethan, who was sitting next to him, looked at his father. "Dad, Mom, will she be a part of this someday?" Daniel paused, choosing his words. "Mom will always be your mom, and I hope that in time you'll find a way to be with her. But for now, we're going to focus on us, okay?" Ethan nodded, his fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of his sweater. "Okay." They walked out into the yard where the truck was waiting. Daniel looked back at the house, its white walls, its black shutters, the bay windows that had once seemed to him a symbol of their happiness. He remembered how he and Emily had chosen it, how they had dreamed of the future, how they had laughed while painting the walls. But he also remembered the arguments, the secrets, the pain that had nearly broken them all. He knew that this house was no longer theirs, it belonged to the past. Sophie and Ethan stood next to each other, their backpacks slung over their shoulders. Daniel took the key, looked at the door one last time, and locked it. The click of the lock was soft but final, like a period at the end of a chapter. He turned to the children, his voice soft but firm. "Come on, we have a new home waiting for us." They got into the car and Daniel started the engine. An old song was playing on the radio, something about the road and new beginnings. Sophie looked out the window, her mind elsewhere, but the corners of her lips were slightly turned up. Ethan was fiddling with a chess piece he'd taken from the old house, his expression thoughtful but calm. Daniel pulled out onto the road and the Harper house was behind him, disappearing into the rearview mirror. The new house was smaller but brighter, with big windows and a small garden that Sophie was already dreaming of turning into a greenhouse. That evening, they unpacked the boxes, laughed when Ethan dropped a stack of books, argued over where to hang an old family photo. It wasn't the same family that had lived in the old house, but it was their family, imperfect, wounded, but alive. Daniel closed the last box and looked at the children, asleep on the couch, covered with a blanket. He knew there was a lot of work ahead of them, therapy, talking, trying to figure out how to move on. But he also knew they could do it. He opened his laptop and added one last line to his book. "From the ashes of the past, new shoots can grow if we find the strength to water them." He closed his laptop, turned off the light, and sat down next to the children, listening to their quiet breathing. Outside, Hartford was falling asleep, and spring, despite everything, continued its work, promising new beginnings. The story has come to an end, but our journey continues. Put your light in the comments if you feel emotions, and until the next fairy tale, subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.